Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Health Babes podcast. I am your host, Dr. Becky Campbell with Dr. Crystal Hohn. Today, we have Michael Rubino on. He is also known as the mold medic. He was amazing. He does so much information on mold. He talks about the basics, with the different types of mold, the places that you can find mold, what that means for you. Is it a big problem? Is it a little problem? What to do if you need to remediate, how things that you can do in your house, like for your HVAC system, what mold illness looks like for different people. So I cannot wait for you guys to listen to this episode, and let's welcome Michael. Okay, so we're so excited to have you. We've been wanting to have you for a long time. And mold is a very popular topic, unfortunately, but with what we do, we work with so many mast cell activation patients. And so mold is definitely a hot topic. So we're so excited to have you here. And we really wanted to kind of start out for people who don't know, or people who have a lot of misconceptions around what mold is and the different type of species of mold. Can you just kind of tell us what is mold?
Yeah, of course. Well, first off, thank you for having me. And I'm so excited to find two other people who are just as excited about mold as I am. So thank you for that. Yeah, there's over, is a little bit of craziness here, but there's over 100,000 different species of mold that we know of today. Could be many more. It's like kind of like how we keep finding different fish in the deep sea here. We're finding new species of mold. It's very interesting because the main molds that we look at in a living environment are typically 36 different species, some of which you may have heard of, like Stachybotrys, Scotomium, Cladosporium, Aspergillus, Penicillium. There are molds that we make antibiotics from. Obviously, it has a place in our ecosystem. But from my perspective, when I'm all about creating healthy environments, we're looking at how much mold, what types of mold, and what's going on in our own living environment, because that's where we live, right?
Right. So when like a lot of patients will come to us and be like, well, there's mold all around us. So the testing, it'll be skewed. And so can you talk about how you mentioned 100,000 species, right? But aren't there certain species that are more toxic than others? So can you kind of go into a little bit of that?
Totally. So there's allergenic species, there's pathogenic species, and there's toxigenic species. It gets real confusing because allergenic species could produce toxins. So the mold itself isn't toxic, but the toxin it produces can be toxic. So it kind of breeds this whole discussion of, well, what does all this mean and how do we create healthy environments? Because at the end of the day, that's what people are looking for. I've heard that before, mold is everywhere. It's been around forever. Why is this a problem now? And all the things around that. There's very interesting history if you look at it. If you go all the way back to the Bible and Leviticus, they've been literally doing mold remediation. There's a mold remediation protocol in the Bible. So we're talking, before thousands of years ago, right? So what had happened in the Bible, basically they would have a priest come in and bless it, and they would clean it. And if it came back, basically they would just knock the house down and carry all the stones out about a mile away from the village. So they knew that mold has been a problem back then. So it's not like it all of a sudden became a problem. It's always been a problem. And as far as, just our homes and stuff in the 1970s, that's when we actually started going more towards energy efficiency. And so for those that don't know, with energy efficiency, we're building buildings tighter, better insulated, trying to prevent temperature differentials. So a loss of heat or a loss of cooling, which then requires energy to continue to heat and continue to cool. Well, when we went this route, we forgot that air exchange is kind of important, meaning ventilation or the volume of air, right? So let me give you an example. You go outside and you take a breath. You look all around you. There's an unlimited volume of air around you at that point. Inside your home, there is a limited volume of air, right? Unless you open a window and you have air exchange from outside. And so when these buildings are built tighter and tighter, you're now stuck with a limited volume of air. So what does that mean exactly? Well, the more particles and toxins and chemicals and all this stuff that we have in our environment, with each breath that we take, by the way, about 20,000 of those a day, we're going to have more particles and toxins, et cetera, per breath than we would outside, right? Because now we're looking at dilution.
Right.
So outside, these mold spores, these toxins, they're diluted with just the volume of air, and they're not as diluted inside. So, considering we spend 90% of our times indoors, it's really important that we take a look at this, because there's obviously what is the first health decline in a long time as far as longevity goes. I think we used to live longer and longer, and all of a sudden this year they published, by the way, now we're living shorter again. So
Yeah.
I think we have to look at,
Everything.
everything, because our view has been so narrow on what health and wellness is, and I think we're missing some important pieces here.
For
And
sure.
plus, after COVID, it's like so many people work from home now.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
typically you find, like you were just saying, in your home. I mean, it's so different from other environments. So what are some common places that you see mold can start to grow?
So I would say from a systemic problem, meaning, if I have a massive mold problem, I'm most likely to have it either in my attic, my HVAC,
Yeah.
my basement, or crawl space.
Mhm.
This
Yeah.
is what creates the most impact, because it's the largest surface area of our home. Building pressures change from second to second, minute to minute, hour to hour. Um, Air does typically rise, but we do have different changes in pressure. For example, if we have soffit vents and ventilation in our attic, when we get a gust of wind, that can push downwards into the living space, right? When we open our front door to come back into the home, we're pulling and pushing air as we walk through a room. We're pulling and pushing air. So it's just important to know that, because a lot of people say, well, I don't go in my crawl space, so how does my crawl space affect me? It's like, well, unfortunately,
Yeah.
what's in our crawl space gets into our living environment. It all
Yeah.
circulates, and it opportunistically enters our body. So when we're looking at systemic problems that create the most impact to our air quality, it's typically one of those three. Now, what else can it be? Of course, anywhere where water can intrude. So around
Right.
doors and windows, right? Weak spots. Obviously, roof leaks, that kind of covers the attic, though. Then kitchens and bathrooms, right? We have plumbing devices like sinks and stuff. I can't tell you how many sink cabinets I've opened up and seen, just water damage and mold.
Right.
And it was just behind all of this stuff that we keep. We're human
Yeah.
beings, and we don't we don't think to check those things, or think that checking those things are important.
Yeah. And a lot of mold isn't seen to the eye, right? You can't
Totally.
necessarily see it. So that's where patients get all confused. And two, like with the water damage, let's just talk about that a little bit. Does it have to be a lot of water damage, a little bit? Because, everybody's thinking right now, okay, well, I have that pile up of water behind the sink. I have, I get out of the shower and it's a little wet there. Like they can start to get a little bit nervous. So can you
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about the differences, like, or what they need to be looking for when it comes to water damage in these areas that are more prone to that?
Totally. I mean, water creates the opportunity, right? So the more
Yeah.
water, the more opportunity. The less water, the less opportunity. So that's obviously a big thing. But, I've seen some mold problems that were pretty severe and creating a lot of impact to the air quality, from a pinhole leak in a bathroom,
Right.
meaning
Yeah.
like it's such a small drip, you don't really notice it. It never really fully gets wet enough on the front of the wall to notice
Mhm.
anything. But in that cavity, right, where that plumbing is located, you have constant leaking and constant water. There's dust, there's debris, all food sources that mold loves, and it can just start to grow over time. So it's opportunity and time. Those are the two things. So if we
Yeah.
have a little bit of water for a long time, or a lot of bit of water for a little time, you can create obviously an effect here where you're creating an opportunity for mold. And then of course bacteria too is another problem with water damage that we don't want to neglect. But that's how these things really start to thrive.
Yeah.
It's interesting because a lot of people think, oh, well, if I'm going to have mold, that means, it takes years. Like it actually only takes 24 to 48 hours for mold to start to grow.
Wow. I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
So
you want to get on top of it.
So you want, acting fast is how
Mhm.
you stay proactive and ahead of things. The longer you let things take, the more problematic it gets. Oh,
Mhm.
sorry about that.
No worries. This
Little
is real
background
life.
music.
Real life.
Little bit of background music. Yeah. So, because a lot of people think, oh, it's okay. It dried, or, that was just a small little thing. I don't need to worry about that. And then, more and more time goes by, and then that thing gets worse and worse. And I think that's really one of the misconceptions that people need to know. Like for me, I see something wet, that's it, I'm cutting it out and I'm figuring out what caused it to get wet. I'm making that repair. I'm making sure it fully dries before I patch it back up. And I think that's really important. There's another like science, like first grade science class thing that we have to remember here, and it's trap moisture and condensation, right? So for example, if you take a wet sponge and you put it on a counter, right, and you leave it overnight, you pick that sponge up in the morning, the counter is still wet, right? It didn't dry. It's because anytime two surfaces are touching one another, they're going to stay wet for much longer periods of time because there's really no air movement that goes in between to help dry it. So, when we look at our homes, we have drywall, and then that's touching framing, and then that's touching insulation, and then that's touching another piece of sheathing. And then we have our outside wall and stuff like that. So, we have all these layers touching each other. And so it may seem like it's dry, but is it actually dry? And that's what you want to be careful of.
Okay. I have a two-part question. One is, and I've seen on your Instagram, you talk about mold like in the toilet. So let's say you have mold in the shower, in the toilet, and in your sink, kind of, you clean it out, it comes back. And that's kind of is that something you need to be concerned about as far as it becoming a bigger problem, or is there a bigger problem and that's just little signs that it's there? Or is that just something that's little and you just clean it out and it's okay?
Good question.
So I don't really gamble, but if I were a betting man and I had mold in my toilet and in my shower and in my sink and et cetera, I would suspect that there is something going on nearby, because basically mold is two different things. It's the organism itself, and then it's also the particle that it creates, which is called the spore. And we just, the industry just kind of lumps it all together, which creates more confusion, unfortunately. But the organism has to be somewhere producing spores. Then those spores have to get to, they just kind of circulate around the house in our dust. And then when water is opportunistically present, that spore then starts to colonize and grow into an organism, kind of like how seeds become plants, right? And so we have all of these seeds all over our house already because mold's part of our ecosystem. Some obviously have more than others. But once they become organisms, they're creating a lot more particulate. And so if I start seeing mold all over my bathroom, you're like, wait a second, well, where do the actual spores come from first? Because, typically when you see something that drastic, it's not just like one or two spores that happen to opportunistically land on that wet environment. No, there's got to be an abundance there because, especially 250,000 spores can fit on the head of a pin. So just for frame of reference, mold spores are between 25 and 50 times smaller than what the eye can see. So we start seeing patches of mold in different places. The question always is like, well, where did that mold come from?
Right.
To then get that. So mold can be so insidious in our homes because it's like once we have it, it just spreads, right?
Yeah.
And it gets worse and worse and worse. And that's why it's like, where are the big problems coming from? Where are these organisms largely growing? And how do we remove them to reduce the amount of spores that are naturally occurring in our environment? And then, of course, when we have things like good HVAC filtration, good cleaning protocols, we're not really going to have an abundance of spores in our environment, which is going to be better for our health and better for our investment, which is our homes, because then we're not going to have these opportunities propping up all the time. So I think that's really the simplicity of how it works. But yeah, it's very, it's just a very fascinating thing for sure.
Yeah. So this is my second part to this question. So let's get a little bit bigger. Okay. Let's say you have mold, you change out your sink, right? And you have an abundance of mold, or you see it kind of creeping in on the tile of your bathroom or under, you start pulling back the flooring, whatever it is, laminate, and you can see it under there. So a lot of people think, oh, I have it in my bathroom or I have it in my kitchen, so I'm going to remediate and I'm just going to stay in this room and I'll be fine. And we're like, no, don't do that. So can you kind of explain why that is, to some people who are going through this?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, if I work with anybody on fixing their environment, step one is like, cool, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Because,
Get out of
you
there.
know, you don't want to stay there and continue to subject yourself to that environment if it's something that's not making you feel well. Uh, the interesting thing about remediation and mold and all this stuff and learning how air pressurization works is I don't care if you're across the house and you're
Right.
remediating a room across the house. A, you already have mold there that's circulating. B,
Right.
it doesn't matter what engineering controls you have in place, no home is hermetically sealed. So that means that even if I control the pressure, right, of your, let's say, bathroom for this example, and we make sure that nothing gets out of that bathroom, right? Here's the problem. When you put something under negative pressure, right, what is that doing? It's pulling everything towards that room, right?
Yeah.
So we have mold and we have toxins in the home already before the remediation began, right? That's why the remediation is happening. Well, those spores and toxins circulate across the home. They get trapped in interstitial cavities. So now with negative pressure, I'm pulling everything towards that bathroom. And what's going to happen to the person that's standing in the middle of that? It's like being in a sandstorm and
Yes.
just sucking all that stuff in. It's going to make it
Yes.
10 times worse. So
Mhm.
living in a remediation doesn't make sense. It just
Mhm.
doesn't. It's going to make things worse before it makes things better. And
You do.
so with that in mind, you know, how do we remediate? Well, even if we remediate one room while we're out of the house, we know that it's going to bring stuff into the environment. What has to happen next? Cleaning, right? We have to
Mhm.
clean all of this dust that's going to have heavy contamination, which gets pulled into the environment from the remediation process. Now, this is
Mhm.
good because now we don't have this perpetual contaminated dust continually entering our environment and making us feel unwell. But it is part of the process where you got to hyper clean after to make sure we're getting rid of that. You know, if you've ever been part of a remodel, I think you'll
Mhm.
know what I'm saying. You know, like 6 weeks after a remodel, you're looking around and you're like, I just cleaned this place like 60
Yes,
times
all the
already.
dust and
And
the
all the
yes,
dust just
the
keeps settling.
drywall.
Well, that's what happens,
Yeah.
especially when you're pulling and moving air. And the difference is that drywall dust is annoying. This
Mhm.
drywall dust can make you sick. And
Mhm.
so it's really important that, you know, proper steps are followed. And I know it seems crazy and you think there's plastic up and you're good, but you have to understand the way buildings and this type of stuff work because you're going to be affected if you don't, you know, really make that wise choice to get out for a couple weeks and let them do their thing.
For
I
sure.
agree.
Yeah.
What
And if
about, I'm
oh,
sorry,
sorry, Beck.
Crystal. What about dust and its relationship to mold?
So what's interesting about dust is pretty much everything. We have gravity on planet Earth, as we all know, right? And everything settles just like the way our dust settles. So, you know, what's really nice about dust is one of the ways that I measure the contamination that people are being exposed to in their own homes is I test the dust.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, you know, most people in this industry that I've been so gracefully a part of, they all test the air. That's like their way of screening. You know, let me just test the air. I'm happy to dive into that because it's really fun to kind of
Please.
talk
Please
about the science
do.
behind all
Please.
that. But you know, really in 2015, when the EPA kind of released what many of us may know as ERMI, with that being said, came across using PCR technology, which I think we all know what PCR means these days, for the purposes of looking at mold and looking at the DNA of what's there. It's really interesting because when we test our dust, we're actually testing where everything settles.
Mhm.
And so if we look at toxins and we look at mold spores and bacteria and fragments and all of the things that we don't necessarily want to be breathing in an abundance, it's all going to settle within our dust.
Yeah.
Now, if it's in our dust and it's not in our air, how does it impact us? Well, have you ever sat on a couch on a sunny day and you saw that ray of light peek through that
Poof.
window
It's
and you're
all
just
the
like, huh, there's all this stuff floating around
Yeah.
that I don't see. Your eyes literally are trained to just kind of blur all that stuff out. You just see through it unless the light happens to block the particle and then you can see it, right? So what's really interesting about that is after that, I think that's like one of the first time as human beings, we realize, wow, our dust is everywhere. So what happens is mold settles in our dust, becomes part of our dust. Then our dust recirculates, and then we're just breathing it in. So
Exactly.
whatever's in our dust is in our bodies. And that is lesson number one that we need to learn. That's why testing our dust to make sure we're getting an understanding of what is in our environment is going to be much more effective than testing the air to see what's in our environment.
So when you're doing testing, just so listeners understand, you're only testing dust. So can you walk us through that process a little
No,
bit?
I wouldn't say like
Okay.
only testing dust, but that's like the entry point. Like if I don't feel well, I go to the doctor. What do? They screen me, right? Let me take a look at all these different things that could be wrong. And then, hey, we found some abnormalities. Now we're going to do a deeper dive into that, right?
Right.
This is that same approach for the home. And it's let's screen the home. Let's see what abnormalities are there. And then from there, we can understand, where these things are coming from through additional testing. So I think that's really the best way to do it, because right now, many people, they go to a doctor, they say, I don't feel well. Maybe the doctor leads them down this path where mold might be a problem, which is great, by the way, right? Because now we're having more awareness that our environment can have an impact on us. But so now they're like, okay, great. Well, I have mycotoxins in my body, so I have to be exposed somewhere. So I think it's probably my home where I spend 90% of my time, right? So I call a mold inspector, just your, local run-of-the-mill guy. He's 5 minutes away. So excited for him to come here. He comes in, he sets up this little tripod looking thing, right? And he's just running this air sample.
Yeah.
He takes maybe 2 or 3 of those. Okay. And then he tells, by the way, he's telling me how nice my place is. It looks great. It's so clean. I'm like, thank you. Are you helping me find anything? I don't think we're going to find much, but it's so clean here. And then what happens? We get this report and it's 3 air samples.
Yeah.
And there's very little in there.
Negative,
and he says, guess what? Congratulations. Your house is clean. There's no issues here. Now, that's what's on the surface for an entire industry for so many people. And that service to test 3 air samples is not very cheap either. I mean, we're talking $1,000+ to get almost no information. Now, why doesn't air testing work? There's 2 reasons why it doesn't work for screening purposes. It works for other purposes, and we'll talk about that. But for screening purposes, there's 2 reasons. One, when mold binds with dust, it is too big to fit inside the air cassette that they test. So how an air test works is it collects the mold spores into this cassette, and then they analyze those mold spores, count them with the eye under a microscope, and tell you what they're seeing. How many per square cubic meter, all the different species they can physically see under a microscope. And that's it. That's what it is. So all of the mold that's in our dust doesn't make its way into that cassette because the dust is too large. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2, knowing that the dust doesn't fit in there and that it can't analyze that, then it can only pick up isolated spores that happen to be floating around in the environment before it binds and attaches to dust. Well, the further away from the problem you are, the less likely you are to have that. What did we learn during COVID? That, stuff really only travels a few feet through the air before it binds with other stuff and settles, right? So what we've seen is you test 4 feet away from a problem, and it almost is like the problem isn't there.
Right.
But if you test 3 feet or closer away from the problem, eureka, you're finding it. So that makes all the more challenge, because if you live in 1,000 square foot home or a 10,000 square foot home, doesn't really matter either way. That's a lot of square feet to try to triangulate the amount of air tests that you would need would be impractical.
Yeah. Michael, when you're taking dust samples, are you just going throughout, like, kind of explain that process a little bit so that people, especially when they're looking for different companies to do this for them, and just giving them more of the tools to do that?
Yeah. So essentially what you're doing is, I mean, there's no reason you can't do it on your own. By
Okay.
the way, I mean,
The
they're really,
Hermes
because
test,
if,
right?
if,
Mhm.
if you can take something and wipe it across the surface and collect dust, you can do this.
Yeah.
So you're essentially, that's what you're doing. You're taking a sanitized cloth, you are collecting dust. You need at least 5 milligrams. So if you look at like a Swiffer cloth, for example, 1/5 of the Swiffer cloth would need to be covered in dust,
Okay.
approximately. You are sending that into a lab. The lab utilizes the PCR machine and it detects the DNA of what's there. And it tells you how many spores essentially per milligram of dust.
Hmm.
And it's really interesting because what we utilize is we utilize the EPA's data. They tested 1,000 homes. Based upon those tests that they've done, they've really reached a range of normal. And this is a very interesting conversation of what normal always means because it's very subjective.
Yeah.
But the reality of the situation is, at least we have an average of what the
Mhm.
average home looks like.
Yeah.
And if we know if it's 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times higher than normal, this is something we want to see lower, right? There's no threshold. We don't have, I don't think we'll ever have a threshold because the reality of it is we know that every single human being is different.
Yeah.
You know, what makes you sick is not necessarily guaranteed to make me sick.
Right.
And so with that being said, 100 spores of, you know, let's just say aspergillus versicolor, that
Mhm.
may set your immune system over the edge. You may feel unwell from that. Where for me, it might be 150, right? So how could we ever set a threshold? We can't. What we can do, though, is we can obviously look at data. So if we have certain mycotoxins in our body, you know, we're looking at, you know, what mycotoxins are those and how do we reduce that exposure? And then we can trace that back to, well, what's found in your dust
Mhm.
happens to be, it's almost 9 out of 10 times when the person has like ochratoxin A, we're finding high levels of aspergillus, right?
Yes.
When a person has high levels of trichothecenes, we're finding high levels of stachybotrys, right? So this is all data that we can correlate, and then we can say, well, this person needs help reducing this exposure, and we go ahead and do that. And I think that's the simplicity of it. I mean, for so long, this industry has been this like technical, subjective thing
Yeah.
to create
Yeah.
healthy environments. But
Mhm.
it's all along, it's been just so simple. It's correlating things together, just like we do in the medical community, and making sure that we're putting people on a path to lower these exposures so that they can heal.
Yeah.
We have so many patients who they're really sick, and we know they have mold and they're like, but my spouse is not, and they don't believe me. And
Mhm.
we always have to try to explain to them, like, some people can tolerate, like you were just saying, mold, and they can take things in and push them right out, and some people really hold on to things too.
Sure.
And I think that it's sad because there's a lot of disbelief, from
Mhm.
their partner in what they're truly feeling and how it's affecting them because they don't feel it themselves. So
Totally.
when we talk about so kind of two things. It's like, one, can you be being affected by mold and not be symptomatic? And then another thing is, what are some of the symptoms to look for?
I can't tell you how many conversations that I have had with
With this.
clients who are like,
Mhm.
"Can you talk to my husband?"
Yeah, us too.
Yes.
Uh,
It's hard.
there's been some. Can you talk to my wife too? Of course. I mean,
Mhm.
whenever someone is not
A
affected, we don't
spouse. Yeah.
understand. But I'll just call a spade a spade. It's majority
Yes.
women needing help with their husbands, and as a husband myself, I can understand and appreciate that. Um, what ends up happening is I have this conversation. It's something that I enjoy having because I think at the end of the day, we're trying to connect dots that, for this is a societal problem. So it's not just your husband or your wife or your
It's so
spouse.
true. Yeah.
This is a societal problem. We're trying to connect dots in people's minds that have never been connected before.
Right.
Right. As a matter of fact, just like 20 minutes ago, I have this brainstorming session with my team about, what it is we're actually doing, right? We're creating healthy environments.
Mhm.
People don't know what that means, right?
Right.
Right.
I'm talking about like the health of your home that affects the health of your body. And they're like, what? How does that? This is a brand new concept, right? And honestly, I think the only reason we have probably any awareness of this at all is actually from COVID, right? Because it was really the first time in this modern generation that we've seen something that we can't see create such a devastation, right?
Yeah.
And so
That's
now we're
true.
like, oh, well, all right. So yes, there's viruses, there's mold, there's bacteria. People are starting to get a sense of there are these very tiny things that we can't physically see that can harm us. And so it's connecting some dots, but you know, I get on the calls with folks and you know, it's the same stuff. It's, you know, mold's been around forever, you know,
Yeah.
how come I don't feel it, you know?
Yeah.
And so because I don't feel it, it can't be that. It has to be something else, right? And
Right.
that's really what the main, you know, idea that people get into their minds. It has to be something else. But you know, one of the stories I tell people, which I think people find interesting and kind of helps connect some dots a little bit, is like I was like, look, so my wife and I and my family had COVID, okay,
Yeah.
and I would imagine we got it at the same time. I would imagine it's the same strain. I can't guarantee it, but it would be weird if it wasn't the same exact strain,
Right.
right? However, it was night and day symptoms wise,
Difference.
because I was like knocked out for 3 days in bed with like fever. I literally lost like 20 pounds of water weight. It was horrible for me. But
Yeah.
luckily I bounced back pretty quick after those 3 days and all was fine. My wife, she was running around like there was no problem in the world, but she lost her sense of taste and smell. Okay. And I had my sense of taste and smell. So I'm like, haha, you don't have taste and smell. I can taste. And she's like, haha, I can move, you know? and so it's really interesting. But we had two different total reactions, right? So we have to stop saying because I don't feel it, that doesn't
Exactly.
make it real, because that's not how this works.
We're all genetically different. We're
Right.
all dealing with different toxin load. I mean,
Totally.
we're different.
Totally different backgrounds too. You know, I mean, toxins get stored in our fat layers of cells, right? And so who knows how many toxins we have from our childhood that have been carried with us and how that plays a fact into things. I mean, there's many unknowns to this whole puzzle here. But the fact remains is that, you know, we have to stop saying like, this can't be real because I don't feel something, you know, explore it, because this is a new frontier here. And this new frontier is, well, we take 20,000 breaths per day. We spend 90% of our time indoors. I wonder if what's inside of our home could have an impact on our health and well-being. And based upon what I see, you know, in practice, it's a lot. It's alarming. It's alarmingly a lot. But for someone who's not sitting in my seat and hasn't talked to the people that I've talked to and hasn't seen their pain and suffering, I could understand and appreciate that they don't get it, right? But I think that, you know, when we start talking about some of these things, we start breaking down the science, we start leading them to thoughtful and careful research, they start to understand. And at some point, it becomes a roll of the dice of, well, you know, I know too much at this point not to give it a shot. And when people jump in with both feet and they actually correct issues inside their home, they happen to see a remarkable difference.
Yeah.
That's so true. Yeah. Beck was asking you a little bit of the symptoms patients can experience too. Can you, you know, for listeners that are like, oh my goodness, could I be going through this? Or this is why I can't get better, or kind of walk us through some of those.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is very wide range of symptoms, like very wide. But, you know, I think the best way to do it is to kind of walk is we were born and then we grow old, and it's kind of better to walk through that path a bit. You know, as a mother, we've seen infertility issues, which complicate childbirth and things of that nature, which obviously is very disheartening. As a child, we're seeing PANS and PANDAS, behavioral issues, you know, SIDS and other really scary and crazy things. I've seen so many challenging families go through so many different things. There's a family that comes to mind right now that the Walker family, who their son has just constant bouts of seizure. And we found like really alarming levels of mold in that home.
And people, what I always tell people is mold is a neurotoxin. So it's
Totally.
really, you're going to get a lot, for some, you're going to get a lot of neurological symptoms. When I lived in mold, I would say that is how I would describe it. I mean, neurological symptoms. I thought I had MS for sure. Like that's what I thought I had. It was 100% I have MS, and it wasn't, it was mold, but it can vary, right? So much. Some people just have a stuffy nose.
So much.
People
And
have-
it impact, I mean, I'm seeing differences at different age groups too. I mean, you know, in teens and adolescents, we're seeing, you know, more anxiety and depression and you know, skin issues and all these things that develop. In you know, as we get older, we're seeing, you know, menopause issues, you know, we're seeing as we continue on, we're seeing neurodegenerative diseases like the early onset of Alzheimer's or dementia. You know, and I'm talking, you know, early, it's called early for a reason. You know, we shouldn't be in our 40s and 50s and starting to have dementia or Alzheimer's. You know, and obviously there's a lot of other things like respiratory issues. A new report just came out from the BBC that says 1 in 6 cancers are caused by poor air quality, based on a study that's been done at the university. So I think it's, you know, we're obviously learning more and more every single day, but it just makes a lot of sense to me, right? I mean, we have particles and toxins, and when we are overloaded by those things, right, whether it's radiation or VOCs or formaldehyde or mold, it's going to have an effect on us. And obviously different particles will provide different symptoms. But in the essence, the goal is the same. We have to pay more attention to the quality of air that we're breathing. And that unfortunately goes beyond just the air. It's the dust and what it you know, products we use and everything that gets into our body. You know, it's taking this holistic approach.
It's interesting that you mentioned formaldehyde and Crystal, I don't know, we've never talked about this. If you, how you dealt with, the, you know, doing what we did in school with the lab, with
the cadaver lab.
The cadaver lab. I can say that is when I truly started feeling out of control with my symptoms, was when I was in cadaver lab in school, and there was an enormous amount of formaldehyde exposure,
mold,
and
for
I
sure.
think like getting terrible headaches and just feeling bad, you know, just feeling really bad. So it's crazy.
And formaldehyde is like almost in every single thing we use.
I know.
You know, from
It's
our
disgusting.
wood flooring to our furniture.
Yes,
you know,
the furniture. It's like, I didn't realize I bought my kids like a wood bedroom set, and I felt like I was dying, and I was like, get this out of here now. And I started researching, and it was like most wood is, you know, treated with formaldehyde. And I was like, no wonder.
The magic sponge, those white magic sponges we use to clean off, you know, the hard to get off things from everything. Formaldehyde. You know, it's really unbelievable how much formaldehyde we use in our society, how much chemicals we use in our society. You know,
I know. It's so sad. And it's wreaking havoc on our health.
Totally. 100%.
It really is. There's a reason why there's more sickness today than back in the day.
And why is it? It's because these all affect our body in the form of foreign particles that our body now has to fight to remove.
Yeah. You know, we didn't ask you in the beginning, but I know you have your own story with this. So can you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So my own story is somewhat interesting, I guess. You know, I've been around construction my entire life. My dad's been a restoration contractor since I'm 5. He did primarily fire restoration. So it's a bit different, but you know, houses catch fire. Obviously they get put out with water. So mold's part of the problem there, but there's actually so many interesting things with fires because you have arsenic and heavy metals and crazy chemical reactions that happen when plastic is burning and things of that nature that all have to be removed. So, you know, growing up around that, it was very interesting because I got to learn a lot about, you know, how this affects our air quality long after the fire is gone. if it's not dealt with properly. Mold was always an issue. I got to see a lot of those things. But I will tell you, I was at that point in my life, I was thinking more about like the arsenic and heavy metals and how that might play a role. And this is, when I'm 5, it's 1993. I wasn't thinking about mold at that point in time. And even later in life, when I was working for my dad in the summer times and things of that nature, you would see mold, you wouldn't really think of it as a big deal, right?
Right.
It wasn't really until 2012, Hurricane Sandy hits, a big event like that. A lot of people come from all over the country, start remediating homes. It's a big money grab, and insurance companies and FEMA and all that stuff kind of foot the bill. Unfortunately, you get a lot of bad work that happens then. I mean, the work really hasn't been good in the industry, even when they're trying, let alone when something like that happens. And so what was interesting to me was I started seeing a pattern of people getting sick. And I started connecting dots because I'm like, wait a second. So you're sick and you're sick and you're sick. And all of these homes were supposedly remediated. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, wait a second. So but they all were fixed and they're all sick. And this is like the first time people are starting to tell me that they're sick and they think it's from mold. And, if you look at the history of mold and stuff in modern times, 80s and 90s, it started to become a popular thought that mold can make people sick. There was that big case in Cleveland in 1993 where 100 infants had died or gotten really sick from what was Stachybotrys. And so, again, it was a concept, but it wasn't really something that was really apparent to me. It was probably about the 5th or 6th person in the span of a year that was like, okay, this is very odd. And I started looking more carefully through the results. And I started seeing patterns of, there's mold in these areas at a lot higher quantities for an area that should be remediated. And what was really interesting is even some of the areas that looked okay, when you looked at, when you just looked at like the HVAC system and stuff, the HVAC system was never cleaned. That was had super heavy, high amounts of contaminated dust. And I started putting all this together. That was where I kind of discovered mycotoxins, right? That mold produced mycotoxins. And then we had to develop a process to remove mycotoxins and be able to guarantee that. So it really, all this came to pass. And one of the overarching themes that I realized is that these guys who do mold remediation don't understand microbiology. I mean, here you actually need microbiologists who understand construction to work in your home. Because if you don't know microbiology, how would you know something is actually fixed? And that's really what I started to realize. They didn't understand that mold was an organism and a particle because none of the standards were talking about that. They didn't understand mycotoxins, or that mold produced a toxin called mycotoxins. They weren't testing for it. They weren't remediating it. And what I saw clear as day to me was that the entire industry needed an overhaul.
Yeah.
And
We see it
that's
too.
right. And that's what it still needs an overhaul. It's not like it's fixed yet, but that's the direction it's heading in, right? It's this whole thing needs to get flipped over and fixed, because the reality of the situation is, I don't care how much drywall you cut out and how much insulation you remove. If you don't understand that organism was producing particles and toxins as long as it's been there, and you're not helping to address that side of things, this person is never going to get better, no matter how much you quote unquote remediate. And that's what we were seeing. And that's why people were getting sick. Through that journey, I kind of became known as like the mold whisperer in the New York area, and would go in and help really sick people. And that was kind of how things came to be. But I think what the pinnacle for me was, I'm not going to fix this one house at a time. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
I need to go out there and start educating people of how to fix this properly on a larger scale. And how is that going to work? Well, it's got to be at the consumer level. And the reason why it has to be at the consumer level is because there's one big thing standing in the way: insurance companies.
Yeah.
So if the consumer doesn't educate themselves, then when they actually need to file an insurance claim to make sure that they're environment is restored to what's considered original condition. Well, if they don't know what that means, people are going to come in and just haphazardly fix things and not restore it to original condition. And then lo and behold, this can affect their health. So it's been an interesting ride, this journey so far. But I feel like I'm just getting started, truthfully.
You're doing a good job. You have a great page, and I refer everybody to you. I do.
Well, thank you for that.
Yes.
And I feel like, definitely needs at least another 10 years working at this to try to push things forward. But we've made some good strides. I started a nonprofit called Change the Air Foundation this year. Change the Air has officially partnered with the IICRC and the AFHA. And we're, going after political reform in the term of making sure people are properly protected. Because if there's one thing I know right now, it's accessibility is one of the largest problems. Because we don't have these protections and coverages in place, doing things wrong is expensive. So imagine doing things right. And so there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that just cannot afford to do things the proper way. And it's absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah. It is. We see it all the time in practice. It's just, it's like when we know someone has mold, we're like, Lord God, it's so sad.
It's a big process. Yeah,
it is. I want to talk a little bit about the MERV 16 filters. You've talked about those. They're a really good cost-effective way to improve your air quality. Can you dive into that a little bit?
So MERV is an efficiency rating for filters. And it's interesting is the higher the MERV rating, the smaller the particle it removes.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way to look at it. So if we have like a MERV 16 filter, that's going to get down to a much smaller particle and remove that particle more often than, let's say, a MERV 8 filter.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's interesting about this whole thing is most homes don't even have MERV 8 filters. They have cheaper filters that barely catch dust, let alone anything else.
We're talking in the HVAC system.
In the HVAC system.
Yeah, just so people who know what we're saying.
And so, MERV 16 is a technology that came out roughly 2017. Through that technology, it was really one of the first times we're able to look at viruses, capturing bacteria, toxins, mold, etc. And before that, it was capturing some spores, not all spores, definitely not fragments, and definitely not mycotoxins. And so if it's not collecting that, it's definitely not collecting bacteria and definitely not viruses either. And I think, in order to create a healthy environment, we want something that's going to remove as much particulate as it possibly can. And I think that's really been the key to this is how do we look at air quality now as we move forward? And it's the whole environment, it's not just the air, it's just the environment, because if we know that our dust is going to have contaminants, well, then we got to try to keep our places dust free.
Yeah.
If we know that our dust is going to get in our air, well, then we want to try to remove the dust from the air as it does aerosolize. So when you put a better filter on an HVAC unit, just for people listening, it essentially turns your HVAC unit into an air purifier.
Yeah.
What's an air purifier? It is a vacuum and a filter. It sucks the air in, filters it, pushes it back out. That's all an air purifier is. Sorry for all the people I've just upset with the trade secrets here, but our HVAC system does something very similar, except that vacuum conditions the air, makes it at a temperature that we desire, and then puts it back out into the space. So filtering our HVAC is going to do two things: protect our coil, which constantly condensates and provides a nice environment for mold and bacteria to grow. And it also purifies our air at the same time. So I think if we start to do these things, we're going to see a world difference.
Yeah, I just put the MERV 16s in my, I have 2 air handlers. So, and this is a newer, I just bought this house recently, and I was like, I've never even saw where these things were. They're like up in the attic. And the guy, and I had known about the MERV 16, and he actually recommended them to me as well. And I was like, okay, I like you.
Yes, you know about them.
get me his
Cool.
number, because, you know, most HVAC guys you talk to, they're just like, oh, we'll sell you this. It's comparable. And then you look at the comparison, you're like, this is not comparable, sir.
No. And I bought it on Amazon. Like he didn't
Yeah.
even sell it to me. So
That's
yeah.
amazing. Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, that's been another challenge is with HVAC guys. I mean, they're really good at putting together metal and, you know, buying equipment and putting it in and all of that stuff, but they tend to know very little about air, which is always
Yeah.
been mind blowing to me. So it's great that you found somebody that understands good filtration and recommended it to you, because it's like every time I'm working on a project with an HVAC guy and I'm like telling the client, get this MERV 16 filter. 99% of the time I get an email back a couple of days later. How about this other filter?
I
That's
know.
like MERV 12 or 13. And you're like, okay, well,
That's not what I said.
It's not as
Yeah.
good,
Mhm.
but it's your call.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Okay. So besides the improving the air quality, like what are some good ways to remove mold? You know, there's a lot of debate on bleach and that kind of thing. So what would you say?
Well, definitely not bleach. So
Nope.
we can end that debate. You know, for those who love to look at, you know, really credible sources of information, you know, me just being a guy talking to you, sometimes, you know, it doesn't really strike the quite same. Go to the EPA's website, right?
Yeah.
And type in bleach and mold.
Yeah.
Right.
And the EPA will tell you all the reasons why you shouldn't use bleach, or really any biocide for that matter, or any chemical, because those things are designed to try to kill mold. And the
Mhm.
objective shouldn't be to kill mold, it should be to remove it.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like going into your lawn and spraying weed killer everywhere. Like, you're okay if your objective is to kill everything, but it's still there and dying and shriveling up in your yard, fine. But if your objective is to remove it, you grab it and you pull it by its roots and it's removed, right? Problem solved. Well, we need to look at that same mindset in our home, because mold does have roots called hyphae, just like weeds do. It produces spores, just like weeds produce seeds, right? So it's very, very similar. But yet we just try to like always want to spray something and try to kill something in our home, which never actually works. It's why it keeps coming back, right?
Mhm.
What we want to do to remove mold is simply twofold. If it's growing into something porous like drywall, unfortunately, you have to cut the drywall out. There's
Mhm.
no way to sugarcoat that. I'm sorry. You just have to do it. If it's growing in your tile or grout or something like that, that's non-porous, well, that's good. Then the roots are growing, you know, horizontally. You can then wipe that clean. So you have to kind of know the porosity of the material you're working with. If it's semi-porous, non-porous, or porous. Semi-porous like wood, or grout, as an example, it needs to be scrubbed. You need to abrasively remove the roots from the substrate, because at that point, what's happening is the roots are growing into the pores of either the cement or the wood. Non-porous like glass, plastic, metal, you're fine. It's growing actually on the dust on those surfaces. And when you wipe it, it's gone.
And what are
Put
you
anything
using
on
as
it.
like the solution? Like let's say it's in your shower. What are you putting in the shower before you're scrubbing it, if anything?
So when it comes to like wood structure, meaning like the structure of the 2x4 walls that are not coming out in remediation, I use hydrogen peroxide. This is going to
Mhm.
oxidize, help pull to the surface. Same thing with cement. So cementitious products like tile, grout, etc., you know, foundation floors, what have you, I'm going to use hydrogen peroxide. Now, when I'm wiping down walls and furniture and things of that nature, I'm going to use Benefact. Why? Because we're not looking to pull it out of anything. We're actually at this point looking to degrease, wipe it away, you know, and you're really looking at more of a toxin and spore perspective. If you see mold physically growing into something, obviously that's, you know, a little bit of a problem in terms
Yeah.
of your furniture and stuff. You should just toss it.
Yeah.
But when you're just worried about settled spores and toxins, Benefact and microfiber towels, it's really all you need to clean. You know, the emphasis doesn't really need to be on the cleaning product itself. You know, you want to accomplish two things. You want to essentially degrease, because we're human beings. We have lots of oils in our life between this skin and the stuff that we touch and the cooking and things of that nature. We just exude a lot of grease, if you will. And
Mhm.
so with that being said, you know, dust and particles can stick to that grease. So soap to help kind of degrease and separate stuff from our surfaces is great. So any product that you use that kind of soaps up, that's going to be helpful. And, some sort of botanical disinfectant like Thymol. So Seventh Generation's a great brand. It's
I
actually
love
made
them.
by
I use them all the
Benefact.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too.
What about vinegar?
There's a lot of good and bad with vinegar. I think, it can definitely work as a disinfectant, in certain spots, but, I don't know that it's effective against mycotoxins. It doesn't really have that degreasing property. And with toxins, toxins, if you look under a microscope, they're like a black tarry sticky substance. So, thankfully, a lot of the toxins stick to the spore and the dust. But
Mhm.
to be absolutely safe and thorough, the best thing to do is to actually, use something that soaps up that can help
Mhm.
separate particles and toxins from surfaces. Because if you actually test for mycotoxins, like a good credible test would actually be the media for that would be an alcohol wipe as opposed to like a Swiffer cloth, because
Okay.
the alcohol wipe is going to help kind of remove it from the surface and make sure that you're getting any stuff that might be stuck to something.
Okay. Very cool. This is awesome information. Thank you so much. And just to kind of close things, if someone's going through, mold, what are some of the steps to heal the mind and body after that you would like to talk about?
Well, step one, it's obviously hard to heal when you're living inside the problem, and that's one of the more challenging aspects of this is like, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I do this? You know, whatever it takes and whatever you can do, that's what you
Yeah.
do, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you can't do things that you can't do. So whatever you can do, you do. When it comes to, healing the mind and body, I'm not a doctor.
Mhm.
Totally recommend people work with doctors. We talked earlier about how the body is just inherently complex.
Yeah.
Every single person's different. I may, I'm looking at my desk where I have some supplements here. Like I may have a supplement that works well for me
Yep.
that doesn't work well for you.
Yes.
And
True.
We
so,
see that a lot.
We do.
I mean, I have talked to so many people and this binder is the best, but then you ask another person, they tell you that binder is
They
the
feel
worst, right? So
awful.
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So everybody's different. I think working with doctors who are experienced enough to know that. And,
Yes.
when something doesn't work, it's okay because they have 6 other backup plans for you to
Mhm.
try,
Yeah.
and it's that willingness to kind of conform to the person and making sure that whatever they're working is going to work for them specifically. And I think that's really, really important. Don't give up on the journey whatsoever because, there's always options. There's many, many options. And, you just have to find the right option for you, no matter how frustrating that may be. I've also been hearing fantastic things about like brain retraining and things of that
Oh,
nature.
it's been a game changer for our
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
It really has.
Total.
Yeah. And the reason being is because, one of the things that people don't realize, like back to science here, is stimulus response. You may have heard that term before, but just to give you an example, like if a fish gets bitten by another fish,
Mhm.
it's actually going to create a recording. And
Mhm.
it's if that fish senses that it's in a similar situation,
They're just
this
stuck in
fight
it.
or flight response kicks in so they can skirt, and it's meant as a self-defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, human beings have this, right? And whenever your body thinks it's in a similar situation where you may have had a traumatic experience, in this case, mold and getting sick can be a very traumatic experience.
Mhm.
It's going to stick into that fight or flight response, and that's trying to alert you that you're in danger, get the heck out of there.
Mhm.
Well, if you're stuck in that 24/7, then even the smallest amount of mold can set you
Mhm.
off.
Yeah.
That's really what creates this condition of hypersensitivity, right? So
Mhm.
now all of a sudden, our body thinks even one spore is too much for us. Will create the same result that maybe a million spores created, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like this A equals A equals A equation that it doesn't really make sense because everything is different.
Yes.
So I've heard really good things about brain retraining and getting out of that flight or flight response so that we can, not be so hypersensitive to our environment and not have these wild symptoms when we're in similar situations that might not be as similar as we actually think. And I think that's really been a very fascinating route. Obviously, with brain retraining, it's a new phenomenon.
Mhm.
It's not like this widely accepted thing in medicine, but
Right.
it makes a lot of sense to me. And I
Mhm.
think seeing the possibilities that happen with this and watching this go down that road, I think is going to be very important, because we can't keep operating the same way anymore.
Right.
Mhm.
When we like just kind of a little of what we do with patients, we definitely start with getting out of the environment. And we make sure your detox pathways are open before you
Mhm.
start trying to pull anything with binders. So
Mhm.
Mm.
we do that gently, and it just depends on the person what we think they can tolerate. It might be something as
Sure.
little as castor oil packs or
Mhm.
infrared saunas, whatever. We have a whole bunch of stuff we'll try. But and then brain retraining, like depending on the person, we will definitely put that in there, and then we would start to try to get it out of your body, because it makes you very sensitive. And some
Mhm.
people aren't, and they can totally handle going right into like a protocol with binders and all that, but we work with some really sensitive people. So we have to really start with like
Sure.
little baby steps,
Mhm.
So it is
Totally.
important to work with people who know how to approach things differently per person and have
Mhm.
a bunch of stuff in their tool bag. So
Yeah.
Totally. Well, that's why working with you guys is so helpful, because of course, you know these things, right? And
Mhm.
you got different strategies for different folks, and I think that's really important because, you know, I know you guys have heard this story before where a client comes to you and says, "I've been to 30 different doctors, and
Yes.
you
yeah,
know,
we
Mhm.
get
according
it
to
every
them, I
day.
have 72
Every day.
different diseases."
Yeah. And they
Mhm.
have 1,000 supplements.
Yeah.
They're like, and I can't handle any of them. We're like, all right, let's just stop, and start
Let's
Yeah.
put the brakes on, right?
Well, let's talk
Exactly.
about your book, because
Yeah.
you have a book, and then I want to know about your book and then where else people can find you.
Sure. Yeah. So in that 10-year journey, I wrote a book called The Mold Medic, and an expert's guide on mold removal. And the book is about really my journey and kind of how all the things that I've seen along the way. And that it kind of stretches from that into, some of the things that I've discovered that have been extremely helpful for people, whether they're extremely sensitive or just looking to create, better, healthier environments. Talks a lot about, how to identify mold, how to remove mold properly,
Mhm.
all the different steps to take. And then not only that, but how do I make sure it doesn't happen again? Right. So a lot of the prevention strategies and making sure that, spaces are built back properly. Talks a lot about the HVAC and how to handle the HVAC, not only from, replacing or cleaning as needed, but filtration too. And it kind of, I talk about the chapter's called The Elephants in the Room. And that's where I literally break down all of the different, like, it's more of a industry specific elephants in the room,
Mhm.
but it's helpful for a consumer to read that so that when they
Yeah.
are calling professionals, right, they already understand what people's talking points are of, why you shouldn't use PCR and why you
Yes.
do this, right? Because you make some calls and you're going to get people saying things that out of context that may make sense but
Mhm.
actually doesn't if you know the science.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
there's a lot of that too that just kind of helps dispel some of these myths that some folks in industry use when they just don't want to provide a certain service.
Yeah.
And I think it's just really important. So it is a short read, about 147 pages. So I'm very straight to the point type of guy when I'm
We
writing
Love
love
books.
it.
that.
We
You know,
love that.
uh, I hate reading those books where it's like, because I like stories too, but I don't want it to be
Yeah.
so much stories that it's like I just
Mhm.
read 200 pages of story and 1 page of actual information I can use, right? So this is
Same.
jam packed with really good information. You can always refer back to stuff, breaks down all the different types of molds, what they mean, what toxins they produce, things of that nature. So I think it's a great little guidebook for people to have.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you. You're amazing. And I appreciate all of your work. And I really do refer everybody. I
We
do.
Good.
Mhm.
Well, then I will help everybody, at least get the first part of getting out of the environment in one
Yes.
fashion or another. Whether it's how do I get out safely? How do I fix what I have safely? Things of that
Yes.
nature. Always happy to help. Appreciate you guys too. And looking forward to continuing to help work together and amplify the
Yes.
message and make sure that, people really understand how important this is to health and so that they can stay healthy.
Awesome.
And what's your Instagram and do you have a website?
Yeah. So Instagram and website are both michaelrubino.com. I used to be at the Mold Medic for those may remember that. So I wanted to keep when you type it up, it's the same. And also someone took Michael Rubino. So that's what it is.
It is what it is. And then what's your Instagram handle? Just so, people know that too.
So the same thing at THE Michael Rubino, and that's RUBINO.
Yeah,
Awesome.
he's got great stuff on his Instagram.
Yes.
So
Yes.
well, thank you so much for coming on. You're amazing. We are looking so forward to this and you've been awesome. So
Well, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being on here. And thank you guys for creating this space for me to be on and share any
Yes.
knowledge I have. So really appreciate that.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. And if you love this episode, please leave a review. It only takes a couple minutes. And you can find out more about us on drbeckycampbell.com. And you can follow us over at Instagram on @HealthBabesPodcast, @Dr. Becky Campbell, and @Dr. Crystal Hohn. Have an amazing day.